Hey everybody, Jay from the St. Palliser University English Club podcast here. Today we're going to be doing something a little different, a little bit more casual than what we usually do. For those who don't know, the academic school year has just ended here in the US. I've finished up my master's degree and I am in the process of moving out of my apartment and getting ready to leave the country to move to Austria on a teaching job for a couple of years. So I am very much in between things right now. So today we are going to be diving into the world of what I at first was calling scenario posts, but I have since started calling skit or bit posts because that kind of sounds like shit posts, and so I feel like bit or skit post fits better into like existing internet parlance. These are honestly one of my favorite kinds of text post on the internet, and I wanted to break down what I think makes them effective, funny, engaging, using the same craft analysis techniques that Andrew and I use on the podcast for fiction, or that I would use in my own private reading and writing or in other video essays for poetry. So we're going to take a literary look at these bit posts. If you're not already familiar with what a bit post is, because I made up the term, you probably have seen them before. There's one particular poster, I guess, on Twitter who used to go by Berwin Tubes, but now goes by a much less iconic name. Their @ is SabatonFan69 if you are interested in following them, or maybe if you already do follow them. Basically, their posts go like this. Usually in the first paragraph or line, there'll be like a character, sometimes it's me, and then colon, sometimes it's the name of a character, and then a colon, and then that character will do something, and then in the next paragraph that will happen again, but with a different character. So I'm going to be reading memes to you in this episode. I acknowledge that that's weird and kind of awkward and kind of cringe, but I don't know how else to do it. They'll be up on the screen as well, and if you really hate me reading memes to you, you can mute me while they're up and then just listen to what I have to say about them. Anyway, here is the first Berwin post that I wanted to take a look at. So in this first line, a Vatican assassin says, "Knew you'd be waiting." Then he says, me meditating, "Did they finally send their best?" Then the assassin says, "Maybe their worst. You killed my brothers. You're skilled. Pope hasn't had this much fun since." And then he responds, "The Crusades? Maybe you knew my wife. She was crusaded. Blades flash." He used to do a lot of these kinds of like fantasy-tinged posts, and there are multiple ones that end in blades flash, which I think is always such a funny ending to these kinds of posts. Not all of them have this sort of like fantasy or historical fiction vibe to them. Some of them, many of them even, are more contemporary, as is the case with this one. So this one doesn't begin with someone speaking, it actually begins with an action, which is pointing at a little alien freak in Star Wars. "Look at that guy, lol, he's awesome." And then the character's mom's boyfriend says, "Ploon Scrooby of the Yadlin 5 system? If you knew anything about Plu Screw and his backstory, LMFAO. Yo Dan, dude likes Ploon Scrooby. His buddy Dan who's always at our house. Lol." So you're probably starting to get a sense of what makes up one of these posts, even just from me reading a couple of them. They're a little bit like a green text in that they usually tell kind of a little story, but unlike green texts, they are pretty explicitly fictional. These are made-up scenarios. They are like bits that you would do with a friend privately in your own home, but in this case, your friend is a Twitter poster and you are just reading the post. So you're kind of like watching the bit that this single person is putting on play out on like a virtual stage. So it's a little bit like Twitter improv, I guess. I am not a cultural anthropologist, but my guess is that these bit posts as they currently exist probably first originated on Tumblr. So after 4chan and green texts, which of course still exist, there was a subtle variation on this that appeared on Tumblr, and these much more resemble what we see today on Twitter and still on Tumblr in terms of formatting. You probably scroll past these all the time. You do that classic quick nasal exhale laugh you do when you see a good meme, and then you move on. But in this video, I actually want to argue that these posts have become a kind of microfiction genre with very distinct traits. I think that probably sounds a little bit strange, but it'll be fun. Let's take a look. So before we go on to talk about some of my favorite bit posts, I actually want to take a step back. We've already talked about the internet precedent for these types of posts by briefly talking about the Tumblr equivalent and the green text ancestor of bit posts. I also want to talk about the sort of literary analog or precedent for a bit post. You've probably even heard it before. It's a 6-word story, sometimes attributed to Hemingway, and it goes like this: for sale, baby shoes, never worn. This is 3 quick sentences, each of them 2 words, 6 very short words. Only 2 of them are longer than a single syllable even. One of the key traits of this quote-unquote story, I think, is the escalation of strangeness, and with that strangeness, stakes. This is the story's conflict, in essence, is this escalation of sort of like weirdness or discomfort that occurs across the 3 sentences. So at first, we have this sort of neutral sentence, something is for sale, then it gets weirder, the thing that's for sale is baby shoes, and then it gets weirder and potentially sadder with never worn. This is sort of the story's conflict. There's also an implication of at least 2 characters, I think. There's the baby, and of course there's the sign maker. The sign can't exist without someone having written it, and presumably they have some kind of connection to the maybe extant baby, otherwise why else would they be the one making the sign? There's also the implication potentially of a 3rd character, that being the reader who is encountering this message and sign. So this is a story that, like some poems, kind of implicates the reader in its fiction. Implicates not in like a negative or criminal sense, just that like it involves the reader more so. I also think that the fragmentary sentences render all of the words almost like spondaic, which increases their brutality and tension. And for people who haven't heard some of my other explanations of metrical feet in poetry, or really in just words in general, a spondy is any set of syllables where the stresses are the same. So you have 2 stressed or 2 unstressed syllables back to back. Because this story is so short and so intense, to me, every single syllable reads with similar emphasis, so it becomes almost spondaic. This, I think, also increases the tension of the piece. There's so much action that's implied in this piece as well. It occurs outside of the text itself. Namely, something has happened before this to render this meaningful. That is to say, something happened with this baby that prompted someone to sell these shoes and make this sign advertising these shoes. We don't know, and the story asks us to speculate. Maybe there was a miscarriage, maybe there was a false positive pregnancy and a rush to buy a whole bunch of stuff, maybe it was a useless prank white elephant gift at Christmas time. We don't know. The implications could be completely sinister, or they could be completely mundane. But I think that some of the fascination that this story, and along with that fascination, some of the engagement that it creates, arises from that invitation to speculate about what occurred. As we'll see, many bit posts rely on this feature as well. They'll sort of ask us to think about either what happened before this situation to lead us here, or they'll imply that something is going to happen afterwards. And usually, either of those time periods, before or after the present tense of the post, is used to create some kind of comedic effect. Let's take a look now at an actual bit post. I have titled this one VeggieTales. Many of these don't have titles, of course, because they're just posts on the internet, but I've given them titles, in part to help myself remember which ones I'm doing in what order, but also to help put us in the headspace of real literature. Like, I want us to be thinking of these as actual writing with actual intent behind it. If it is that we're going to be talking about these as microfiction, it makes sense for them to have some kind of name by which we can easily refer to them. To follow off of what I was saying about the Hemingway quote-unquote Hemingway short story. This bit post, as most bit posts will do, asks us to speculate about the future rather than the past. I would argue that the Hemingway one, a lot of the fascination lies in the past, what happened before the story. In this one, the locus of the fascination is more so on the future. Random guy. It's not a big deal, man, I just don't think it matters. Me pulling out a gun. The main two characters in a show called VeggieTales are fruits and that doesn't matter to you? Waving gun around. It's not a big deal? So this bit post implies the existence of two characters. There's this quote-unquote random guy, and then there is the me, the main character, who unusually in this one speaks and acts second. The first line of dialogue establishes this casual tone with the not a big deal man moment, as well as the conflict and stakes of the story. In this case, we have an interpersonal conflict between these two characters, our main guy and then this guy that he doesn't know, this random bystander. The self-insert protagonist escalates the conflict in the second line of dialogue and reveals what the fight is about. So not only does the second line raise the stakes, increase the tension, it also includes more information about the quote-unquote plot of the thing. And it introduces this element of absurdism when the situation escalates to deadly violence. That is, he's waving a gun around about VeggieTales. I think something else that makes the situation feel even weirder and therefore funnier is that these two people don't know each other. The first guy speaking is literally a random guy. Critically, I think the story ends before anything actually occurs. So, the story asks us, the post asks us to speculate about what happens afterwards. And because we don't know, we can kind of like insert whatever is funniest to us. Now, I'm not saying that like every person who reads this literally plays the situation out in their head until some kind of narrative conclusion or ending happens, but the story dropping off so suddenly before a definite thing actually does happen is funnier, because it implies a future, much like a good poem would do, without explicitly telling the reader, without holding the reader's hand, without letting the thing drag on to the point where the weirdness of the situation stops being funny and entertaining. Another way of thinking of these moments where the bit post builds up to something and then suddenly drops off is as a bit sonnet-like. So if you've watched any of my other videos or listened to any of our other content where I've talked about sonnets, you'll know that sonnets have one critical component, which is the volta or turn. So that's a moment when the poem takes an unexpected twist. Sometimes it's at the end and you can think of it as kind of like a twist ending, but it's key that this twist isn't cheap. It's not like a it's all a dream moment. It's more like a moment where all of the previous information that is in the sonnet prepares you for something that is sudden, is unexpected, but still fits within established precedents. So these bit posts are kind of taking you right up to the moment of where a volta would be, and then they just stop. So they build up your interest, and then they leave before they get boring. That's another way of thinking about it. Let's take a look at a few more examples. This next one I think is probably my favorite of the bunch, and it's actually from Tumblr. I'm calling this one Puppy Dog City, and you might be familiar with it. If you're not, you'll see why it's called that in about 0 seconds. Reluctant friend. Puppy Dog City is a myth. We should turn back. Grizzled mercenary. It's getting dark. Keep moving. Puppy girl. Puppy Dog City's real. It's a city full of puppy dogs, a place I'll belong and fit in. It's home. I saw it. Eccentric scientist. The implications are astounding. This one I like a lot, in part because it has additional narrative complexity due to the increased number of characters. Often these will have 2 or 3 characters. This one has a whole ass 4 characters, which normally I think in a piece of fiction this short would frankly be too many. This one, though, works really well because the number of characters is actually meshing perfectly with where the humor in this one originates. So a lot of the humor in this particular post is derived from the reader's familiarity with narrative tropes and archetypes. So if you've ever seen like a fantasy adventure movie, or honestly like some kid's adventure movie where a bunch of unlikely characters get together and go on a silly quest, you'll recognize these characters as tropes. We have kind of the flaky friend, we have the more grizzled, experienced, cynical leader-type character who probably by the end learns how to love. We have this plucky main character puppy girl who's a bit naive and has something to learn about harsh realities. And then we have this eccentric scientist. We'll get to him in just a second. This one isn't just humor based on archetypal tropes, though. The first speaker, who is our deuteragonist, actually reveals two conflicts immediately, which sets up the stakes of the quote-unquote story. One of them is interpersonal between himself and the protagonist. They aren't quite agreeing about whether or not they should continue seeking Puppy Dog City. Then we have the other, which I'm calling the central conflict. This conflict also reveals the goal of the story. It's to find Puppy Dog City, so sort of all of these characters are unified by this goal of finding this location. Immediately, within a single line of dialogue, the story has both tension, in the form of will they reach the city, and stakes. If not, what will happen to the friendship between the reluctant friend and the puppy girl protagonist? The second speaker then increases tension and adds to the physical setting of the piece with the line, "It's getting dark." "It's getting dark" implies not just that we are running out of time, it also implies that danger is increasing with the dark, otherwise why would he have brought it up? The third line of dialogue finally introduces our actual protagonist. This is unusual in that it has sort of led us quite far for a text post without introducing our main character. I would argue that because we're expecting that to occur earlier, the fact that the author withholds it until later keeps us interested for a text post of this length. So we know it's coming, we're waiting for it to occur, then it finally does, we get a slight release of tension, and this character is instantly sympathetic in their tone. They also have a completely understandable and interesting character motivation. We're all familiar with stories where a character's goal is something as simple as get to a place. This is familiar, but it's also made strange and funny by the place being Puppy Dog City. We can imagine what this is. We don't know exactly. The joke lies somewhere in between our kind of knowing and kind of not knowing. Finally, our fourth speaker, who is this eccentric scientist, rounds out the post with sort of like a punchline type ending. Like all of the other characters in this post, he's essentially a trope character, but he's especially funny in this context because he feels a little bit too sci-fi for this setting that like otherwise feels quite fantasy. So we have like this girl who's part animal, we have this silly friend, and then we have like a mercenary and they're going through somewhere it's getting dark, you can imagine a forest, but then suddenly we have a mad scientist and it's like, where did he come from? He doesn't quite fit in. That's kind of funny. This twist, to me, works as a kind of volta. So whereas the previous post, VeggieTales, cuts off right before what we might call the volta, this mad scientist adds a volta on the level of our expected tropes. You might say that it still drops off right at the edge of the narrative volta in that we don't know if they make it. We don't know if they even find somewhere safe before dark. Again, the story cuts off before anything has really occurred, before any kind of climax or closure is reached, but that kind of has to happen for it to be funny. This next one we're going to look at, I appreciate a lot for how dense it is. It packs a lot of information into a single line of dialogue and a dialogue tag. I'm calling this one Tedious Anecdotes. I have so much lore, lol, person who has a few tedious anecdotes. This one implies a lot. And I think its formatting is also interesting and unusual for the fact that it is formatted like a quote that's being attributed to somebody. At first, it appears to have just one character, that being the speaker of the quote, but then the attribution of the quote actually reveals, I would argue, a second character. The tonality of the word tedious tells us that someone is telling us this quote, and that that person wants us to see the speaker of the quote in a certain way. That being, the person who's telling us that this is a quote wants us to look down on the quotee. So this person is kind of like creating a kind of camaraderie, familiarity with us, the reader. This tension between the person telling us the quote and the person being quoted also implies a story, implies conflict and tension. That story being that the guy who's telling you the quote dislikes the guy he is quoting. So we have interpersonal conflict as we have had in the previous 2 bit posts. Everything else about this is up to our speculation. We don't know why these 2 people dislike each other. We don't know why they spend enough time together that one can quote the other directly despite really hating him, and we can imagine like what kind of silly circumstances or antics they might get up to together. Personally, I like to think of them as roommates or coworkers that are forced into close proximity. One of them is sort of like an aloof scholarly type, and the other one is like a very normal guy that the aloof scholarly one resents for no particular reason. It's another familiar type of dynamic, a familiar narrative setup, but the familiarity, and with that familiarity, the ability to quickly understand and laugh at what's occurring, is part of what makes this microfiction genre what it is. Because if you think about where these posts appear contextually, they're appearing in a space where you see maybe dozens of them, maybe even hundreds of them at a time, and you're scrolling past really, really quickly. So parts of them have to be familiar enough that we grasp it immediately, and then they have to be unique enough that we read the whole thing and we laugh as we scroll to the next. So it's this really, really delicate balance, I think, of familiarity and unfamiliarity. Last and certainly not least, we have Bitpost 4, which I'm calling the big game. Sometimes these bitposts have pictures attached to them. These add a little bit of zest. I would argue that the adding of a picture kind of makes it more of like a hybrid bitpost where it's sort of part meme at that point, but the pictures, if they're going to be present, have to add something. So in this one, we're going to talk a little bit about that. My dullard roommate. Hey, can we use the TV for the big game? Me. Ah, the big game. Enjoy your juvenile pursuit. Not to worry, I'll be in my study. As we've seen in previous bit posts, the first line of dialogue once again introduces that there are 2 characters and that there's a kind of interpersonal tension between them. This is our central conflict. The second dialogue line humorously reinforces the speaker's opposing personalities and resolves the immediate conflict, that is, whether or not the roommate can use the TV, which creates a kind of narrative closure not seen in other posts of this kind. However, it doesn't solve the underlying issues between the 2 roommates, which seems to be this irreconcilable difference of personalities, suggesting that the tension and the conflict between them will continue in other forms. So, yet again, this one suggests a past. Somehow these 2 characters have existed together. And it suggests a more prominent future in that, presumably, they will continue to disagree and have similarly silly squabbles. Of course, the thing that really mixes this one up is the role that the picture plays. I don't know where this dragon image came from. It was really blowing up on my timeline a few weeks ago, but has kind of calmed down since. I hope that it was drawn ironically, but something about this like sort of older high fantasy style combined with the way the dragon is reclining like a person gives it this weird like anthro type of vibe where like it seems like the person who was drawing it maybe didn't fully realize how silly it looked. Anyway, I like the corniness of it in this context, specifically because it undercuts the seriousness of the protagonist. The protagonist being the roommate who calls his roommate a dullard. So this roommate being a dragon, where presumably the other roommate is just a regular guy, makes the situation, like we saw in the VeggieTales one, even weirder and even funnier. And the fact that we see the picture after reading the post, because the picture is attached to the bottom of the post, kind of allows us to read the post a second time, imagining that one of these is like a dude and the other one is a big red dragon, and that's pretty funny to me. Of course, it also serves a narrative function, namely that we learn that he's a dragon, so it's introducing information at the same time as it's being funny. It also gives us another piece of information, depending on how literally we want to take the picture. That being, the setting that we're in is this like castle that has a study, but for some reason, there's roommates. Like, I don't know in what situation you would be where you're the owner of a castle and you have your own study, but also like you have to have a roommate that you hate and he wants to invite his football bros over. It doesn't make sense if you think about it too much, but like if you just take it at face value and you just laugh at it, it's funny before you start to like realize that it's a little bit nonsensical. All that to say, I really like this one. I think it works without the picture, but I also think that the picture adds a lot to it, and it creates a fun kind of like subgenre of this subgenre that is bit posts where the pictures sort of change the way that we read them. Finally, I want to take a look at what makes a good bit post on the whole. If we had to sort of like talk about the parameters of this genre, what would we say that they are? Well, the number one thing, and it's really obvious, but I think it has to be said, is that these are funny, or they at least sort of are striving for humor. Often that humor comes about via some kind of absurdity. It also comes about via like brevity and this combination of novelty and familiarity. But again, key thing is that it's trying to be funny. This type of genre doesn't exist without the humorous element. Secondly, the first line of dialogue almost always establishes at least two characters and the tension/conflict of the story. Usually those characters are the two people who are going to be in tension with each other. Sometimes not quite so much, but usually that's what happens. The second line of dialogue or second paragraph increases the tension and then often ends the story on a cliffhanger. So many of them, even though some of the ones I looked at today were 3 or even 4 lines, many of them just drop right off after the second line. They don't need to be any longer than that, and they end on a cliffhanger. The advantage of this is that it lets some version of the rest of the story play out in the reader's mind, or alternatively, it lets the reader then like laugh and scroll past really quickly. They don't pause to dwell and pick apart like I'm doing now. They just move right along. They've had a good experience, and that's it. If there are additional lines of dialogue, they might introduce more characters, or they otherwise continue to add information while simultaneously subverting reader expectations. I would say that in the fourth and final one we looked at today, the dragon picture kind of operates as a form of this additional line, in that it is adding more information about one of our speakers and about our setting, but it's also subverting our expectations by making that speaker a dragon and making that setting an ugly castle. If there are going to be pictures, while I'm on the subject, they absolutely have to do both of these things. They have to add information to the narrative, and they have to be in some way silly. In this case, the humor of the picture comes from the fact that it seems to be taking itself quite seriously, but it's of something that like is a little weird, looks a little bit unnatural, and at least in my eyes, the art style of which is like kind of off somehow. Originally, I had put the outro next, but I want to take a quick pit stop here and talk about like why I don't consider these kinds of bit posts poems. Maybe that's not a question that anybody else is asking, but it's one that I was asking myself as I was getting ready to record this, and especially now as I'm reading this script again out loud. I mean, I've made all of these comparisons to poetry. I've talked about voltas, I've talked about lines, I've talked about speakers. If that's the case, what makes these not poems? Well, there's a couple of key things that I would say make these really fiction and not so much poetry. Although they're brief, although they have voltas and maybe even lines, they sort of have this prioritization of the narrative element. That is, what we really care about in these is not the interesting language itself, although there is sometimes interesting language. What we care about more so is the characters and what kinds of wacky scenarios that they get into. So we care about the story, no matter how brief it is. Another thing is, again, that sort of like lack of investment in language as an interesting thing in and of itself. If you read poems, you'll often see weird combinations of words, unexpected combinations of words, enlightening combinations of words, sentence structures that deviate from what's considered like normative or correct in order to create additional meanings. That isn't really happening here, so I would say that makes them not so much poems. And finally, the most conceptual, and I think probably the most important as well, is that these, as I've alluded to, are often scrolled past really quickly. They are not meant to be treated as I am treating them right now, by pausing and really analyzing the component parts of them. They are meant for you to glance at, laugh at, send to a friend, and then never think about again, unless you are a weirdo and you save them in your camera roll like I do to look at on long plane rides, and then you draft video essays about them. A good poem is not just able to withstand a great deal of scrutiny, it is designed to be scrutinized. And I don't mean scrutinized, again, in like a negative way, like somebody is looking at it like looking for things that are wrong so they can actually tell you why it's a terrible poem. I mean that they are really applying pressure, the pressure of analysis to it, to see what it is saying, what it is suggesting about the world, about the speaker or the author's worldview, and it's ultimately interested in communicating some truth that feels extremely personal and extremely meaningful to the speaker or to the author. These obviously are not that. These jokes about papist assassins are not deep commentaries on like the structural issues within the Catholic Church. And that's fine. They don't need to be. Not everything needs to be that, but they aren't that. And so I think that ultimately that separates these from poems and plants them firmly in the realm of like the comedy microfiction short story. Hey guys, I had intended for this to be kind of a quick one, but looking at my recording time now, it looks like this might end up being even longer than some of my other videos. If you have scenario posts that you love, drop a link below, send them to our Twitter, which is at SBU_English Club, our Instagram, which is the same, or our email, englishclubpodcast@gmail.com. You can also contact us via our website, englishclubpodcast.com, where you can see all of our episodes, both our YouTube episodes and our podcast episodes. You can see poems that I have published in various places, and you can donate to our Ko-fi and PayPal if you feel like throwing us a few bucks. You can also join our Discord. I believe the link to that will be in the video description. And once again, I've been Jay, and I hope you guys have a great day.